The first thing Commander Mara Voss noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable kind, not the quiet of a sleeping base or a calm morning in Colorado Springs. This was something being removed in silence. Like the world had exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in. She was standing on the roof of UNDF headquarters when it happened. Coffee in hand. Watching the sunrise paint the Rockies in burnt orange and rose gold. She had 11 minutes before her 0600 briefing. 11 minutes that she had protected fiercely, the way soldiers protect the small rituals that keep them human. Then the sky cracked. Not an explosion. Not a sonic boom. Something quieter and more wrong than either of those things. A sound like every radio frequency on Earth being tuned simultaneously to the same dead channel. A white noise that lasted exactly 4 seconds, and then stopped. And where the sky had been blue and empty, there was now a shape. It hung above the atmosphere like a continent that had decided to go vertical. Massive. Gray-brown like old bone. Completely, utterly still. No engines that anyone could identify. No visible propulsion. No heat signature that Earth's satellites could measure with any confidence. It simply was, the way a mountain simply is, giving no apology for its existence. Mara didn't drop her coffee. That detail would later appear in every profile written about her. She didn't drop her coffee. People would say it meant she was fearless. What it actually meant was that her hands had stopped receiving signals from her brain. She was frozen not with calm but with a total systemic pause, the way the body sometimes stops completely before deciding what to feel. Her phone buzzed. Then again. Then 14 times in 4 seconds. She answered the first call without looking at the screen. "I see it," she said. General Howard Blaine's voice came through rough and stripped of its usual authority. "The object is sitting at 62 kilometers above sea level. It's above 12 cities simultaneously, Voss. We don't understand the geometry yet." "What do you mean simultaneously?" "I mean our satellites are showing the same object above Denver, Shanghai, Lagos, Sao Paulo, Moscow and 7 others. At the same time. One object. 12 locations." Mara gently set the coffee aside. "That's not possible," she said, because someone had to say it. "No," Blaine agreed. "It isn't." Within 6 hours, every government on Earth with a functioning communication system was on the same encrypted channel. Within 8 hours they had all agreed, for the first time in recorded human history on anything at all, that no weapons were to be fired. Not yet. The object had done nothing aggressive. It had simply appeared. Within 12 hours it spoke. The transmission came through every device simultaneously. Phones, radios, televisions, laptops, the speakers of cars and the intercoms of hospitals. Even devices that were turned off. Even devices that had been destroyed. A recovered hard drive in a landfill outside of Nairobi powered on for exactly the duration of the message and then went permanently dark. The voice was not a voice exactly. It was sound arranged into meaning without passing through the usual structures of language. People who heard it didn't experience it as words but as understanding, the way you sometimes wake from a dream already knowing what it meant without being able to describe it. The message was this: you have been observed. You have been assessed. The Gilthead Conclave has determined that your civilization presents an unacceptable risk variable to 11 neighboring systems. This correspondence is not a negotiation. This letter is a notification. You have 40 of your rotations to reduce your global weapons capacity to 0. If this condition is not met, reduction will be performed externally. We do not wish you harm. We wish you containment. Then silence again. The kind that follows when a door closes. Mara spent the next 40 minutes in her office bathroom, sitting on the floor with her daughter, back against the cold metal of the supply cabinet, thinking about her 7-year-old daughter Clara, who was in 2nd grade in Colorado Springs and was probably drawing horses, the only thing she had wanted to draw since March. She was not having a breakdown. She was making a decision. When she stood up, she had made it. She walked back to the briefing room and sat at the table where 14 of the most powerful military minds on Earth were already arguing loudly about launch protocols and deterrence theory. She waited for a pause. "We're not doing this the way we've done everything else," she said. General Blaine looked at her. "Meaning?" "Meaning we've spent 6,000 years getting excellent at fighting each other. We know the geometry of human conflict. We know the pressure points, the escalation ladders, the red lines." She paused. "They don't know any of that. And Caro, right now, that is the only advantage we have." The room went quiet in a different way than the sky had. This was the silence of people who were beginning to think. The Gilthead did not have a word for grudge. This was not because they were a peaceful species. It was because their memory architecture, the biological structure through which they processed and stored experience, did not retain the emotional temperature of past events. They remembered facts. They did not remember wounds. Ambassador Siren 7, the Conclave's designated interface for what they internally classified as the Voss situation, had been studying human communication patterns for the equivalent of 3 Earth months before making contact. She, the pronoun was approximate. Gilthead existed in a perpetual state of biological flux that made gender a mostly irrelevant category, had reviewed 847 years of recorded human conflict. What she had concluded was reasonable, given her framework. Humans were dangerous because they were inefficient. They wasted enormous resources on conflict that produced no measurable systemic benefit. They fought over territory they couldn't fully use. They destroyed infrastructure they then had to rebuild. They killed members of their species over symbolic disagreements. From a Gilthead perspective, the issue was not cruelty. It was malfunctioning. What Siren 7 had not understood, because there was no data set that could have shown her this, was that the inefficiency was not incidental to humanity. It was load-bearing. The grudge. The wound remains unhealed. The memory retains its warmth for decades. These were not bugs in the human system. They were the engine. She would learn this, but not gently. Mara Voss requested direct communication with the Conclave on day 3. The request was processed in 11 seconds. Siren 7 appeared, materialized was the better word, in the secure chamber beneath UNDF headquarters that had been hastily retrofitted with whatever equipment the engineers thought might matter. Most of it didn't. The Gilthead presence required no special equipment. Siren 7 simply existed in the room, her form a slow shifting of layered translucent tissue, vaguely conical, 3 meters tall, with clusters of light-sensitive organs distributed across her upper third in patterns that changed every few minutes. She smelled like ozone and something else, something that several people in the room would later describe as the moment before you cry. Not sadness exactly. The physiological precursor to it. Mara had read every briefing. She sat across from the alien without flinching. "Thank you for agreeing to speak directly," she said. Siren 7's response came in the same modality as the original broadcast. Not words but meaning, arriving fully formed. "We agreed because refusal seemed inefficient. You would have found another method." "You're right," Mara said. "We would have." She let that sit for a moment. "I want to understand your concern. Do not argue against it yet. Just understand it." Pause. The light clusters on Siren 7's upper body rearranged into a configuration that the xenobiologists monitoring the room would later identify as something close to consideration. "Your species has demonstrated consistent escalation behavior. Each conflict produces new weapons. Each new weapon produces larger conflicts. The trajectory, extrapolated forward, intersects with your development of deep-range propulsion. At that point, your conflict patterns enter neighboring systems. Such behavior is unacceptable. You're afraid we'll export our wars. Fear is not a concept we apply to threat assessment. We have calculated a probability." Mara nodded slowly. "What's the probability?" 91.4% of that, within 6 of your centuries, indicates that human conflict will directly impact at least 3 neighboring systems. And disarming us drops that probability to what? 67%. Mara stared at her. "That's still most of a probability." "Yes, but it is a reduction. You'd destabilize our entire civilization for a 24-point reduction. We would stabilize your neighboring systems. Your civilization's internal stability is a secondary concern." Mara came back to that word later. Secondary. She lay on the narrow cot in her temporary quarters and stared at the ceiling and turned the word over like a stone, looking at what lived under it. Secondary. Not irrelevant. Not dismissed. Something else. That was, in its way, more frightening than hatred. Hatred she understood. It was warm. It meant you mattered enough to be hated. This was cold arithmetic. And humanity, in Siren 7's calculation, was a variable to be adjusted. Not a people. Not a civilization built from suffering and surviving in the long, painful work of learning, imperfectly, always imperfectly, to do better. A variable. She thought about Clara drawing horses. About what it meant that Clara would grow up in a world that had been assessed and ranked and nearly reduced, not by a conqueror, but by something that found conquest too emotionally expensive to bother with. A HFY, she thought. Something in her shifted from the cold precursor of fear to something older and quieter and far more dangerous. She knew what she was going to do. There are meetings that appear on no calendar. No recording. No transcript. No official acknowledgement. One of those took place on day 7, in a converted storage facility outside Geneva. 14 people attended. 8 of them were from nations that, in other contexts, had active territorial disputes with each other. 2 had been on opposite sides of unnamed operations at different times in their careers. Mara stood at the front. No slides. No visual aids. "Here's what we know," she said. "They are more advanced than us by a distance we can't currently calculate. Their technology operates on principles we don't understand yet. Nothing in any earthly arsenal can meaningfully target their ship, or ships, depending on its geometry." Silence. "Here's what else we know," she continued. "They have made a critical error. That got attention. They studied our conflicts. 847 years of them. Wars, genocides, arms races, proxy conflicts, cold wars, resource wars, they saw all of it." She paused. "And they concluded that our aggression is the problem. Isn't it?" Colonel Dmitry Volkov, sitting across the table, asked genuinely and without hostility. "In those conflicts, yes. But they missed the context." Mara walked slowly along the length of the table. "We didn't use aggression every time we faced something we couldn't fight directly, such as a plague, a famine, or an extinction event. We used something else. Cooperation," said Dr. Yemi Adeyemi, the Nigerian systems theorist who had been brought in 2 days earlier and hadn't slept since. "More specific than that," Mara said. "Adaptation. We bet. We found the gap in the problem and we put a human being through it. Not because we're brave, but because we have a very specific kind of stubbornness that looks like courage from the outside and feels like, I refuse to accept this, from the inside." She looked around the table. "They think they're dealing with our weapons. They're not. Our weapons are just the most visible symptom. What they're actually dealing with is the thing underneath the weapons. And they have no idea what that thing is because it doesn't show up in conflict data." "What is it?" Volkov asked. Mara thought about the word secondary, about Clara's horses. "This is about the cold arithmetic of a civilization that had never learned to hold a wound. The thing that makes a wound stay warm," she said. "The thing that doesn't let us forget." The plan that emerged from that room over the next 72 hours was not a military plan. It had no name officially. Unofficially, Adeyemi called it the argument, because what they were building was not a weapon or a defense. It was a case. The most comprehensive, ruthlessly honest, carefully constructed case that had ever been assembled for a single purpose. To make an alien civilization understand something about humanity that humanity had never had to explain before, because it had never needed to explain it to anyone but itself. They were going to make the Gilthead Conclave feel the weight of human memory. Not threaten them with it. Make them feel it. The deadline was 40 Earth rotations. On day 12, Mara delivered the first package. Not a weapon. Not a demand. A data transmission, but constructed unlike any data transmission the Conclave had received from Earth before. Not organized by category or chronology. Organized by emotional temperature. It began with a sound. A field recording from the Somme in 1916. What? Rang. The distant percussion of artillery. A voice, young British, barely audible, saying a name. Just a name. Over and over. A name that belonged to someone who was already gone. Then silence. Then a jump, Hiroshima. August 1945. The account of a survivor, a woman named Sumiko Kirihara, who had been 16 years old and had walked out of the rubble and spent the next 64 years of her life writing down everything she had seen so it wouldn't be forgotten. Then silence. Then the Apollo 8 Earthrise photograph. No context. Just the image. Earth as a small blue-white marble suspended in absolute black. Then silence. Then a piece of music. Beethoven's 7th Symphony, second movement. The version recorded by the Vienna Philharmonic in 1986. The one where, if you listen carefully, you can hear the players breathing. On and on. 67 hours of carefully assembled human experience, organized not to demonstrate capability or threaten consequences but to demonstrate weight. The sheer accumulated gravity of what it meant to be a species that remembered its pain and kept going anyway. Siren 7 processed the transmission in its entirety before responding. This was unusual. The Gilthead typically processed incoming data in parallel, flagging relevant sections and discarding noise. Siren 7 found herself unable to discard sections. She kept returning to the field recording from the Somme. The voice says the name. The repetition of it. She ran it through 3 separate analytical frameworks and reached the same impasse each time. She could not identify what informational function the repetition served. The name was already established. Repeating it added no new data. And yet the sound of the repetition clearly had significant functional weight for the human producing it. She queried her analytical systems. They returned the same answer: insufficient framework for classification. She sat with this information for a long time. In Gilthead cognition, sitting with something unclassified was mildly uncomfortable, like a persistent low-frequency vibration. Their minds strongly preferred resolution. Siren 7 noticed that the discomfort was not decreasing over time. It was, in fact, slowly increasing. She requested a second meeting. "Why does he say the name?" she asked without preamble. Mara had expected a different opening. She had prepared for a different opening. She paused. "Because saying it keeps the person real," she said. "Once you stop saying it, they start to feel like they might not have existed." A long pause from Siren 7. The light clusters shifted in a pattern the xenobiologists had not seen before. But they did exist. Silence does not alter the truth of their existence. "Intellectually, no," Mara said. "But we're not made of intellect. We're made of something that needs to keep feeling the real things as real or we lose them." "Is inefficient." "Yes," Mara agreed. "It's also why we're still here." News of Siren 7's second meeting request spread through the Conclave's deliberation structure within hours, which, given that the Conclave operated across 7 systems through a communication medium that did not use conventional signal propagation, meant something approaching instantaneous. It caused significant disruption. The Conclave had 44 member civilizations. 42 of them had, at various points in their developmental history, been assessed by the Conclave's predecessor bodies as risk variables. 42 of them had been successfully adjusted, stripped of their most dangerous capabilities, guided toward what the Conclave considered stable developmental trajectories. 2 had resisted adjustment. One of those civilizations no longer existed. It was not destroyed by the Conclave. It destroyed itself in the conflict that had made it a risk variable in the first place. The other was, to use a term Siren 7 had now adopted from the human data transmissions, a sore point. A civilization called the Drevashel had resisted adjustment 800 years ago through a method that the Conclave still classified as theoretically impossible. They had not fought. They had not fled. They had done something that the Conclave's analytical frameworks had never been able to fully process, and they were now a member civilization, the only civilization in Conclave history to move from risk variable to full member through a path that was not the standard one. Most Conclave members preferred not to discuss the Drevashel. Siren 7 had now read everything available on the Drevashel 3 times. She was beginning to notice a pattern. The full Conclave convened for a deliberation session on day 19. Siren 7 presented her report. She began not with analysis but with the field recording from the psalm. She played it in full. The mud. The rain. The artillery. The voice. The name repeated. 44 species sat with it in their various biological configurations. When it ended, there was silence. Not the enforced silence of protocol but the organic silence of things being processed. Then a Conclave elder from the Veth collective spoke. "What is the functional purpose of this presentation element?" "I don't know," Siren 7 said. This caused more disruption than anything else she could have said. Conclave representatives did not, under any circumstances, open deliberation sessions with admissions of analytical failure. "You are presenting unclassified data?" "I am presenting data that my current frameworks cannot classify." "That is not the same as unclassified data. It means my current frameworks are insufficient." More silence. "Proceed," said the elder. And so Siren 7 proceeded to do something that had not happened in 800 years of Conclave deliberation. She presented a case not for adjustment but for pause. Not because the threat assessment was wrong. She believed the threat assessment was accurate. But she had begun to suspect that adjustment was not the right response to a civilization whose most dangerous quality was not its weapons. What wounds are for. On day 22, the Conclave transmitted a question to Mara. Not a demand. Not a notification. A question. "Your historical record contains 312 instances of civilizational near-extinction events, disease, conflict, and environmental collapse, from which your species recovered. In each case, recovery required significant resource expenditure and generational suffering. Given this pattern, why does your species not implement preventive systemic modification to reduce the frequency of these events?" Mara read the question 4 times. She brought it to Adeyemi. He sat with it for a long time, then said, "They're asking why we don't fix ourselves." "Yes. And the answer is?" "The answer is complicated." "No," he said slowly. "I think the answer is actually basic. It's just that simple answers are sometimes the ones that are hardest to say. He wrote something on a piece of paper, actual paper which he'd started using on day 15 because he found the physical act of writing helped him think, and slid it across to Mara. She read it. She sat quietly for a moment. Then she drafted the response. The response to the conclave was 3 sentences. We know the pattern. We have always known the pattern. But a species that has never been allowed to fail has also never learned what it means to choose differently, and choice, not prevention, is the only modification that lasts. Siren 7 read the response 11 times. She ran it through every analytical framework available to her. She kept arriving at the same finding. The logic is internally consistent. She brought it to the conclave elder. The elder read it and said nothing for a long time. Then, the Drevashel said something similar. The retaliation nobody expected. On day 29, Earth retaliated. Not with weapons. The world's scientific community, coordinated with a speed and efficiency that had never been seen in human history, powered by the particular urgency that comes from having 11 days left, transmitted to the conclave the complete, unredacted archive of every solution humanity had ever developed to problems it had itself created. The vaccines. The water filtration systems. The post-war reconstruction frameworks. The ozone recovery. The incremental, painfully slow, endlessly contested and reversed and fought over again progress of human rights over 6 centuries. The 10,000 small moments where individuals chose, against their immediate interest, to do the thing that was harder and better. Not curated. Not cleaned up. Every failure included. Every reversal. Every moment where progress went backward before it went forward. And alongside it, transmitted on a separate channel Adeyemi's idea, the scientific papers. Mathematics. Physics. Biology. Not as a display of capability but as evidence of the thing underneath. Here is what a species does with its pain when it decides, in that particular human way, to turn suffering into inquiry. 3 of the 44 conclave civilizations had, at some point in their history, discovered the same mathematical principle that human beings called the Pythagorean theorem. All 3 had arrived at it through abstract deductive reasoning. Humans had arrived at it through trying to build things that didn't fall down. The difference seemed small. Siren 7 understood, after 40 hours of processing the archive, that it was not small at all. On day 31, something happened that had not occurred in conclave history. A member civilization requested to review Earth's archive. Then a second. Then, by day 33, 19 of the 44 conclave civilizations had made formal requests to access the transmission. Not because they needed human knowledge. Several of them were technologically centuries ahead of Earth. Because of the failures. They wanted the failures. The reversals. Moments of going backward. 11 of the 44 conclave civilizations had reached their current state through the standard path. Adjustment, guided development, and steady improvement. The conclave had prevented them from going backward, so they didn't have any history of doing so. They had been, in the conclave's terminology, stabilized. What several of them had begun to privately note, and what no deliberation framework had ever been designed to address, was a certain quality that their civilization seemed to lack in comparison to the raw, chaotic, damaged thing in the transmission. They did not have a word for it. Siren 7, who had now spent more time with human language than any other Gilthean, found one: grit. Siren 7 asks a question nobody had ever asked. On day 35, Siren 7 did something that had no precedent in her role. She requested a personal meeting with Mara. Not official. Not deliberation. Personal. Mara agreed immediately. They met in the same room as before, but this time Mara had the engineers remove everything except 2 chairs. She sat in one. Siren 7 occupied the space above and around the other in her shifting translucent configuration. You have a child? Siren 7 said. Not a question, she had reviewed all available records. Clara, Mara said. 7 years old. Do you believe she will face a near-extinction event in her lifetime? Mara considered lying. Probably, she said. Not necessarily war. Climate maybe. A pandemic. Something we haven't named yet. Does this distress you? Yes. But you allow it. I don't have the option of preventing it, Mara said. Not all of it. Some of it, maybe. We work on some of it every day. If you could remove all future risk from her life, if you could guarantee her safety, would you? Mara opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. No, she said finally. The light clusters on Siren 7's upper body shifted into the pattern that Mara had come to understand, over 35 days, as the Gilthean equivalent of stillness. Complete attention. Explain. Because she needs to learn what to do when things go wrong, Mara said. A version of Clara that has never faced something hard is actually less safe. She's more fragile. Because the thing that keeps you whole isn't the absence of damage. It's knowing you survived damage before. A long silence. We have protected 42 civilizations from damage. I know. You are suggesting that in doing so we may have. I'm not suggesting anything, Mara said quietly. I'm answering your question about my daughter. The conclave vote took place on day 38. 44 civilizations. A simple majority is required to proceed with Earth adjustment. 23 votes are needed. The session lasted 16 hours. Mara did not have access to the deliberations. She spent most of those 16 hours in her office, doing paperwork that didn't matter, because having something to do with her hands was the only way she knew to manage the specific kind of waiting that feels like standing at the edge of something. Adeyemi came in at hour 11 and sat across from her without speaking. At hour 14 he said, "Whatever they decide, what you put together was real. The archive. The transmissions. It was real. It might not be enough. It was still real." At hour 15, Mara stopped pretending to do paperwork and just sat looking at the photograph on her desk. Clara, age 4, at a beach in Oregon. Face completely serious. He examined a piece of seaweed with the concentration of someone discovering a new continent. A SYMJHY, she thought. And from this point forward, whatever happens, we go differently. The result came through at hour 16 minute 7. Not through the global broadcast system. This was done through a direct transmission to Mara's personal terminal, a choice that Siren 7 insisted on for reasons she declined to explain to the conclave. Mara read it twice. Then she put her head down on the desk and for the first time in 38 days, allowed herself to feel the full accumulated weight of what she had been carrying. Adeyemi, who had seen enough of human experience to recognize the shape of that moment, quietly got up and closed the door. The vote had been 21 to 23. 23 civilizations had voted against adjustment. The margin was 2 votes. 2 civilizations that up until day 33 had been expected to vote in favor. Both of them adjusted species, both of them stable and successful by every metric the conclave used, had changed their votes after reviewing Earth's archive. Specifically after reading the failure records. The going backward sections. They had recognized something in those records. Something they could not name but could feel, in whatever biological equivalent of feeling their species possessed. A shape that their own histories lacked. They had voted against adjustments, not because they believed humanity was safe. They voted against change because they realized their definition of safety might be flawed. The formal transmission to Earth came 2 hours later. The Gilthead Conclave has reviewed its assessment of Earth. Adjustment measures are suspended indefinitely. Earth's developmental trajectory will be monitored under a modified observation protocol. Earth is invited to submit a representative to the Conclave's developmental dialogue body, an advisory, non-voting body. This invitation is extended without precedent. Mara read it to the room. The room did not cheer. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed. Something that wasn't relief exactly because relief implies the danger has passed. The danger hadn't passed. The monitoring would continue. The 42 civilizations would not have their adjustments reviewed. The conclave was not dismantling its framework. But something had moved. Something that had not moved in 800 years had shifted 2 degrees in a new direction. 2 degrees is nothing in absolute terms. Over 800 years, it is everything. Siren 7 filed her formal report on day 40, the original deadline, now a date that meant something different than it had been intended to mean. The report was, by conclave standards, highly unusual. It contained no recommendations. It contained no probability matrices. It contained no risk assessments. It was, structurally, something that the conclave's documentation system had no category for. The closest existing category was observational memoir, a form used by field researchers to record qualitative experiences that resisted quantification. Siren 7 had never filed an observational memoir. In 300 years of service, she had always been able to quantify her experiences. The report contained one section that the conclave elder read 4 times and then, unusually, omitted from the official archive. She kept it in her personal records instead. The section read, "On day 35, I asked Commander Mara Voss if she would remove all risk from her child's future if she could. She said no. I have processed this answer across every available framework and continue to reach the same finding. The answer is both irrational and correct. I do not yet have a framework in which something can be simultaneously irrational and correct. I am constructing one. It is taking longer than any framework I have previously constructed. I believe this approach is appropriate. 6 months after the object disappeared from Earth's skies, simply ceased to be present, one morning with the same quiet wrongness with which it had arrived, Clara Voss drew a picture at school. Her teacher, Mrs. Hoffman, kept it for years afterward. It was a crayon drawing of a large gray shape above a blue-green ball. The ball was small. The gray shape was enormous. But in the drawing, several small figures stood on top of the ball, looking up. They were not drawn as frightened. Clara had given each of them a straight posture, chin up. The way her mother stood, Clara would explain, when she was about to say something important. At the bottom of the drawing, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, Clara had written a caption. She had heard the phrase somewhere, her mother, maybe, or a news broadcast, or that particular way that children absorb language from the air around them without knowing where it came from. The caption read, "We didn't look away." Mrs. Hoffman would later say that what struck her years afterward was not the drawing itself. It was that Clara had drawn the gray shape slightly smaller than it actually was in all the news photographs and the blue-green ball slightly larger. She had asked Clara about it once. Clara had shrugged with the precise economy of a 7-year-old. "I wanted to get the sizes right," she said. "Indeed."